Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The lock turned smoothly under Margaret's thumb, the brass knob warm from the evening's fading light. She twisted it once, twice, her gloved fingers checking the mechanism with the precision of someone who had performed the same gesture every night for the past 6 months. Ever since moving to the flat on the Thames embankment. The door was secure, of course it was, and yet she waited there, forehead nearly touching the wood, listening. Outside, rain began its gentle stitching against the window pane behind her. The hallway beyond the threshold was empty. The landing below it, visible through the narrow stairwell, showed nothing but shadow and the dim outline of the gas lamp flickering on the street. Margaret's breath came slow and steady. She was practiced at this now, at the small rituals of reassurance. At 28, she'd believed herself past the age of nervousness, past the tendency to imagine wrongness in ordinary darkness. And yet here she stood, as she stood most evenings, listening to rain and distant foghorns, her hand still resting on the lock as though it might suddenly decide to betray her. She turned away, smoothing the long seams of her black gloves with deliberate care. The gesture was practical, the leather always creased after the day's wear, but it was also calming, a small meditation on order and control. Her palm traced from wrist to fingertip once on each hand, and with each stroke, her shoulders descended by some unmeasurable fraction. The flat was small but clean, organised with the kind of precision that a woman living alone in a respectable neighbourhood cultivates without quite meaning to. The sitting room opened before her now, familiar and half-lit by the evening fire she had tended an hour ago. The flames had settled into that drowsy amber stage where they seem less like fire and more like the slow breathing of something alive and benign in the hearth. A book lay open on the arm of her chair, a novel from Moody's library, not particularly good, but pleasant enough for the hour before sleep. Her teacup from supper sat on the small table beside it, cold now, a faint ring of cream visible on its lip where she'd forgotten to finish it. All of this was exactly as she had left it, and yet. Margaret moved to the window, drawn by that sound of the rain, and pressed her palm against the glass. The pane was cold, properly cold, the way a London window should be in late October, with the Thames's dampness pressing at every brick and wood frame in the neighbourhood. Below, the street lamps had begun to glow, small halos of gaslight emerging from the fog like eyes opening one by one. A few figures moved through that fog on the embankment. A constable, his cape swinging, a woman with a shawl, a man she did not recognise walking with the particular hurry of someone who had forgotten something urgent at home. Nothing wrong, nothing at all. She had told herself this exact thing, in this exact tone of forced practicality, for 3 days now. It began 7 days ago, on a Tuesday she was nearly certain, though the days had begun to blur together in that peculiar way that worry makes them blur. A parcel had arrived at the door. Nothing unusual in this. Margaret received parcels, thread from a supplier in Cheapside, occasional gifts from her sister in Bath, books and notions. But this parcel was different. Not in its size or its wrapping. These were ordinary enough brown paper and twine, perfectly correct. It was the timing that registered as wrong. The parcel had arrived at 6:30 in the evening, well after the standard posting hours. The boy who brought it was unfamiliar, though she did not know all the neighbourhood boys, and he offered no receipt, no explanation beyond. For this address, ma'am. Margaret had thought nothing of it. She had simply accepted it, thanked the boy, and closed the door. But then, 4 days later, another parcel, same brown paper, same twine, same hour thereabouts. This time she'd been more attentive, noticing the identical knot in the string before she even opened it. Identical. Not simply similar, but identical, the same sailor's knot, tied with the same tension, the tail of string cut at the same angle, and the contents were the same too. A quantity of fine linen handkerchiefs, monogrammed with initials that did not match her own. She had kept the first parcel's contents only out of politeness to whoever might have sent them. These she had set aside, untouched, in the drawer of her dresser. A third parcel had arrived 2 days ago. Margaret moved away from the window, back toward her chair, and sat with the particular care of someone settling into habit. She reached for the teapot on the small table, still holding a finger's depth of lukewarm tea from the afternoon, and poured a fresh cup from the kettle she'd left warming near the fire. The sound of water hitting porcelain was familiar, comforting. Steam rose up, carrying with it the faint vegetable bitterness of leaves steeped too long. She added a single lump of sugar and watched it dissolve, the spoon making its small silver clicks against the rim. These sounds, kettle, cup, spoon, the soft settling of the chair beneath her weight, were normal, were hers, were the ordinary furniture of an evening at home, and yet beneath them another sound seemed to press. It was difficult to describe, even to herself, a kind of regularity in the hallway outside her door. Not footsteps precisely, she had told herself this firmly several times over, not footsteps that meant anything. It was simply that, at certain hours of the evening, there would come a pause in the household sounds. A pause, followed by what might have been the shifting of fabric, the breath held in a human chest, and then nothing. The pause would end. The sounds of the building would resume. A neighbour moving about in their flat, a door closing somewhere below, except it came at the same hour each time, between 7 and 8 o'clock, always when the fog was thickest, always when the gas lamps outside had just been lit, always, and it always stopped when Margaret held her own breath to listen. She had told no one. What would she say? That she heard a pause in the hallway? That she imagined, for surely she was imagining, a presence beyond her door? That parcels with wrong addresses had begun to arrive with ritualistic precision? It sounded mad even in her own mind, couched in the privacy of her own thoughts. It sounded like the sort of thing that made a woman unfit for respectable company, the sort of nervous fancy that preceded genuine hysteria. And there was no evidence of anything wrong. Nothing had been taken. No one had attempted entry. The lock was secure. She checked it twice nightly now, though she had sworn to herself she would check it only once, like a normal person. The windows were latched from the inside. Her few valuables, a silver brush, a brooch of turquoise and pearl, remained exactly where she had left them. The only evidence of anything wrong was this, that 3 parcels had come to her door addressed to a name she did not recognize, that someone or something paused in her hallway with a regularity that suggested intention, that the neighbourhood itself had begun to feel different, though she could not quite articulate how. On the street outside, a crowd had begun to gather over these past weeks. Margaret had only half noticed it at first, the way one half notices the slow rotation of seasons. But now, going to market, she caught fragments of conversation. A dock worker found confused and bleeding behind the customs house. A clerk from the telegraph office reported missing, then found wandering near Waterloo Bridge with no memory of his evening. A gentleman seen near the embankment's southern gate behaving strangely, his collar torn, small marks on his neck that he insisted were nothing at all, before hurrying away. And then, the pamphlets. Margaret had found one slipped under her door yesterday, a crudely printed thing, all capital letters and lurid woodcuts, proclaiming in its headline, "A vampire walks London. Beware the embankment after dusk." The pamphlet itself was probably nonsense, almost certainly nonsense. She had lived long enough in London to know that fear was the city's second currency, perhaps its primary one, and that nonsense printed on cheap paper travelled faster than truth ever would. Vampires did not exist. The marks on the gentleman's neck were likely from his own razor, or from a lover's haste, or from any of 1,000 ordinary explanations. Men became confused and lost themselves in the fog all the time. It meant nothing, and yet. Margaret set down her teacup and realised her hand was trembling. She pressed both palms against her skirts, as though she could contain the small tremor through sheer force of will. This was unacceptable. This was the sort of weakness that she had spent her adult life training herself against. She was a woman living independently, which was to say she was a woman constantly being observed for signs of instability, hysteria, unsuitability. She worked as a seamstress and designer for a respectable household in Belgravia, a position that required not only skill but absolute steadiness of nerve. Her employer, Mrs. Ashworth, trusted her with fabrics worth more than a year of her salary. That trust was built on Margaret's absolute reliability, her calm, her good sense. What would happen if she allowed herself to unravel? A sound came from the hallway, a footstep distinct and unmistakable, followed by the creak of floorboard. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but it was only Mr. Holloway from the flat above, his evening constitutional finished, returning to his own rooms. She heard his door open, the sound of him moving about, the small domestic noises of a man settling in for the evening. Nothing wrong, simply a neighbour, simply the normal life of the building proceeding as it always did. Margaret unclenched her fists and forced herself to breathe normally. She needed to do something. This much was becoming clear to her with an urgency that she could not quite ignore. She could not continue like this, checking locks obsessively, listening for sounds in the hallway, examining every parcel with suspicion. But neither could she simply sit still, waiting for something to happen that probably would never happen, all while the unease grew like a plant fed on dark soil. There were men in London who made it their business to know things, men who listened for the city's secrets and made sense of its patterns. Everyone knew the name, Sherlock Holmes, the detective, the man who solved the unsolvable, who saw what others missed. She had heard his name mentioned in her employer's drawing room once, spoken with that particular mixture of scepticism and certainty that London society reserved for anyone who was genuinely good at what they did. If the feeling persisted, if she could not convince herself through reason that she was simply being foolish, then perhaps it would be sensible to consult him. Not because there was anything necessarily wrong, but because a man like that would be able to tell her, with certainty, whether there was anything to fear. He would look at the parcels, at the hallway, at the neighbourhood, and he would pronounce her either sensible or hysterical, and either way, she would know. The thought itself seemed to settle something in her chest, a plan, a direction. Even if she never acted on it, simply having a plan made the weight feel slightly more bearable. Margaret rose from her chair and moved to the window once more. The fog had thickened. It was almost a physical presence now, pressing against the glass. But through it, the street lamp still glowed, and the embankment still held its traffic of evening walkers, and London still breathed its vast, indifferent breath around her small, warm room. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would find a way to send a letter to Sherlock Holmes. Tomorrow she would take this unease to a man who made his business of understanding such things. And until then she would sit by her fire and drink her tea, and try not to hear the pauses in the hallway that probably, almost certainly, meant nothing at all. Outside, rain continued its gentle stitching against the window pane. The foghorns called to one another from the river, and Margaret, in her small flat on the Thames embankment, settled back into her chair, waiting for morning to come. The thought of seeking help, of not carrying this alone, made sleep seem, for the first time in a week, like something that might actually be possible. The morning Margaret decided to write to Sherlock Holmes, she discovered that London had decided to speak of nothing else but vampires. It began at the market, as these things do, with fragments caught between the selling of turnips and the weighing of butter. Mrs. Chen, who kept the vegetable stall, was speaking to another vendor about a man found wandering near the docks, his shirt torn, his neck marked with peculiar punctures. Not wounds from a brawl, Mrs. Chen insisted, but something neater, more deliberate, something that reminded her of illustrations she'd once seen in A Penny Dreadful. "They're saying it's the work of a creature," Mrs. Chen said, handing Margaret a bundle of carrots. "Not a man at all, but something that walks like one." By noon, the theory had evolved. By evening, it had hardened into something approaching certainty. Margaret heard it discussed in the tea shop on Chelsea Road, where she sometimes went to order special thread for her employer's commissions. Two elderly women sat near the window, their voices pitched in that particular tone of excited fear that London society reserved for disasters that happened to other people, in other neighbourhoods, or perhaps nearby, just near enough to be thrilling without being truly dangerous. "3 of them found now," one woman said, her teacup suspended midway to her lips. 3 men, all with the same marks, all drained of something, though the doctors won't quite say what. "Blood," said the other woman, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried further than a shout. "They're saying it was blood, drawn out like wine from a bottle." The teacup clattered slightly against its saucer. "That's madness," said the first woman. "That's pure theatrical nonsense. No one drinks blood in London. We have standards." "Standards," repeated the second woman. with the tone of someone who had heard this word applied to London before and found it insufficient. "Have you seen the pamphlets?" Margaret had seen the pamphlets. They had begun appearing 3 days ago. Crude, urgent things, printed on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. They appeared on doorsteps and under wipers of carriages. They were pressed into the hands of reluctant pedestrians by young boys who seemed to take genuine pleasure in spreading alarm. "A vampire walks London," they proclaimed, in letters so large they seemed to shout. "Beware the embankment after dusk. The creature takes men in the night." There were illustrations, poorly rendered woodcuts of a figure that was only half human, with fangs extending impossibly far and eyes like burning coals. The figure seemed to float above the Thames, which had been depicted as a river of fog and menace rather than the prosaic waterway Margaret saw from her window each morning. What struck Margaret most forcefully was not the absurdity of the claims, but the speed with which London had embraced them. It was as though the city had been waiting for something to fear, had been growing restless with mere ordinary life, with ordinary crime and ordinary suffering, and here, finally, was something extraordinary. Something that made the mundane world feel suddenly dramatic, consequential, alive with danger and narrative. The newspapers had caught up by the end of the week. The Times, with its measured tone and its devotion to facts, reported merely that several men of the lower and working classes have been found in a distressed state near the Thames embankment, bearing unusual marks upon their persons. The marks were being investigated. The constabulary was heightening its presence in the neighbourhood. There was no cause for general alarm, but the evening news, that was another matter entirely. The evening news understood the hunger of London for spectacle. "Creature of darkness preys on London streets," its headline proclaimed. "Vampire sightings multiply. Experts consulted." Margaret read the article in the sitting room of Mrs. Ashworth's house, while waiting for a fitting appointment. Her employer was upstairs, changing into a dress that needed alterations, and Margaret sat with the newspaper spread across her lap like a woman who had simply happened to notice it lying there. The article was careful in its language, so careful that the carefulness itself became a kind of evidence. It did not quite say that a vampire was responsible. It merely reported that some concerned citizens have put forth the theory, and folklore from the continent suggests such creatures do exist, and medical science, while sceptical, cannot entirely rule out the possibility of a person suffering from a condition that mimics. It was masterful, really. By suggesting they were being rational, by cloaking hysteria in the language of inquiry, the newspaper had somehow made the hysteria feel more real, more possible. 3 days later, Margaret went to market and found the crowd different. Larger, more agitated. The usual peaceable gathering of women with their baskets and their gossip had transformed into something closer to a gathering at a public execution. There was a tension in the air, a kind of shared electricity that came from collective fear. A constable stood near the fountain at the market centre, his presence both reassuring and alarming in equal measure. He was there, Margaret realised, not to maintain order, but to be observed maintaining order, to be present as a promise that someone, somewhere, was doing something about the terror. "They found another one," someone said. Margaret turned to see a woman she recognised vaguely, perhaps the wife of one of the shopkeepers. Just last night, a gentleman this time, not a labourer. They found him near Blackfriars, barely conscious, with marks on his neck and his pockets turned inside out. "Are the marks the same?" someone else asked. Margaret recognised the voice of Mrs. Whitmore, who kept a small boarding house near the embankment. "Identical," said the first woman. "Everyone's saying it. The same marks, the same confusion afterward, the same missing money. It's a pattern, isn't it? That's what makes it real. The pattern." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. A pattern. Yes. The woman had seized upon the word that Margaret had been circling around for days, the word that had prompted her to consider writing to Holmes. There was a pattern. Not the pattern the pamphlets and newspapers were describing. Not a vampire, not a supernatural creature stalking the embankment, but a pattern nonetheless, a deliberate, methodical pattern. Men targeted, men rendered vulnerable, perhaps through intoxication or trickery. Men marked by small punctures at the neck, men robbed, men released, confused and unable to articulate what had happened to them, and the pattern repeating, at regular intervals, always in the same neighbourhood, always striking the solitary and the vulnerable. A human pattern, a predatory pattern. but a pattern that had a maker, a logic, a reason. "My cousin was nearly out at that hour," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice tight with a mixture of relief and residual fear. "Nearly went out for his evening walk. If he had, well, he's not a young man. What would it do to him, losing blood like that? The shock alone might kill someone." "The newspapers are saying," began someone else. "The newspapers are saying nonsense," interrupted an older woman, one of the permanent fixtures of the market, a woman whose opinion seemed to carry weight. "Vampires are theatre. This is something else. This is a person doing these things, and the constabulary will catch them as they always do, and we'll discover it was some madman or some thief with a peculiar method. Mark my words." But even as she said it, she glanced around as though checking to see that no supernatural creature had appeared to contradict her. That evening, Margaret sat by her fire and held one of the mysterious parcels in her lap. The brown paper was unremarkable. The twine was ordinary, the sailor's knot identical to the others, but that proved nothing, could prove nothing. And yet, holding it now, with the sounds of London's anxiety pressing at her windows, the parcel seemed to take on new weight, new meaning. Who sent them? Why? What did they want? What did they mean? The parcels contained handkerchiefs, useful items, valuable items, monogrammed with initials that did not belong to Margaret. H. The initials were embroidered in elegant script. Who was H.M.? Was this a warning, a message, or simply a misdirected delivery, as Margaret had tried to convince herself? She set the parcel down and rose to check her door. The lock was secure. Of course it was. She had checked it once, as a normal person would. She would check it one more time, a reasonable precaution, and then she would stop this habit of checking. But as her hand touched the lock, she heard it again. That sound in the hallway, the pause, the sense of held breath, the presence standing just beyond her threshold. This time, Margaret did not retreat. This time, she pressed her ear to the door and listened. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, a sound, the softest sound like cloth moving, or a footstep taken with deliberate care. And then, silence. And then, the slow sense that whoever had been there was gone or was waiting or was... She did not know what. Margaret stepped back from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She moved to her writing desk, took out pen and paper, good paper, the kind she kept for important correspondence, and she began to write. "Mr. Holmes, I am writing to request a consultation regarding a matter that I cannot fully explain, but which troubles me greatly. I live on the Thames Embankment, and I have noticed a pattern that concerns me, and which I believe may be connected to the recent events in my neighbourhood. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about this matter, if you are willing. I can visit you at your earliest convenience, or I can provide further details by post. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Margaret Ashworth." She sealed the letter, addressed it carefully to 221B Baker Street, and set it on the mantelpiece to be posted first thing in the morning. Outside, the fog had thickened to the point where it seemed to have substance. It pressed against the windows like a living thing. And down on the embankment the evening crowds had begun to thin. People were retreating into their homes, locking their doors, checking their windows. The city that had been so hungry for spectacle was beginning to retreat into caution. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and settled back into her chair. She picked up her book from Moody's library, but she did not read. Instead, she sat with the warming cup in her hands and listened to the sounds of the building, the street, the fog-wrapped night beyond. Tomorrow, she thought, the letter would be delivered, and then, within days perhaps, Sherlock Holmes would either agree to see her, or he would decline, and either way the burden would be shared. Either way she would no longer be alone with this. That thought was enough. It was more than enough. She closed her eyes and let the sound of rain, still gentle, still patient, still stitching the night together, carry her towards something that might be sleep. And in London above her, in the fog and the gaslight, the whispers continued, about vampires and danger and the peculiar hunger of a city that had grown restless with ordinary horrors. The letter was posted on a Tuesday morning, pressed into the pillar box outside the corner shop, with a certainty that Margaret knew she might regret by evening. By evening, she did regret it, not because she had written to Holmes, but because she had written to him at all, and now the thing was done and could not be undone, and she had to live with the consequences of her own practicality. 3 days passed. 3 days in which Margaret attended to her work, fitted Mrs. Ashworth's daughter for a new summer dress, measured and remeasured, and adjusted seams with the precision that her employer had come to expect. 3 days in which she walked to market, overheard more fragments of vampire hysteria, heard that another victim had been found, and checked her door lock with decreasing frequency, though she could never quite stop checking it entirely. On the 4th day, a letter arrived in response. It came by messenger, a young boy in a neat uniform who rang the bell at Mrs. Ashworth's Belgravia residence, while Margaret was upstairs in the sewing room, pressing the hem of a dinner gown. The boy delivered it to the butler, who delivered it to Mrs. Ashworth, who, with the curiosity that was her prerogative as an employer, examined it before handing it to Margaret. The envelope was thick, cream-coloured, with an address written in a hand that was precise but not ornate: Miss Margaret Ashworth, care of Mrs. Ashworth's residence, Belgravia. "An admirer?" Mrs. Ashworth said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "A consultation," Margaret said, and did not elaborate. Mrs. Ashworth was not unkind, and she did not press, but she smiled, that particular smile that suggested she had drawn certain conclusions and found them satisfactory. Margaret was a woman, after all, and women who received mysterious letters from mysterious men were at least interesting, even if they were also potentially unsuitable. Margaret did not open the letter until she reached home that evening. She sat by her window with the fog pressing soft against the glass, and she broke the seal and unfolded Holmes's response. It was brief, professional, entirely without warmth or courtesy, which was somehow more reassuring than if it had been cordial. "Miss Ashworth, I shall receive you on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Please come prepared to provide specific details regarding your observations. Come alone. Mrs. Hudson will admit you." S.H. Thursday. 3 days away still. And he had written observations. Not worries, not fancies, not hysteria. Observations. As though he had already decided, simply from her letter, that she was a woman capable of noticing things, of seeing patterns, of being worth his time. The relief was so profound that Margaret had to sit down. Thursday arrived with a kind of aching slowness. The morning was consumed with last-minute work for Mrs. Ashworth. A guest was arriving from the country, and her wardrobe required urgent attention. Margaret's fingers flew through the work, stitching with a focus that was almost meditative. The repetitive motion, the familiar weight of needle and thread, the gradual transformation of fabric into garment. These were the things she understood. These were the things that made sense. But underneath the work, her mind was already climbing the stairs of 221B Baker Street, already knocking on the door, already facing whatever conversation awaited her. By 2 o'clock she had excused herself from Mrs. Ashworth's household and was standing at the corner of Belgravia waiting for a cab. The cab that arrived was respectable enough, a hansom with a driver who knew his business and did not ask unnecessary questions. Margaret climbed aboard and gave the address. 221B Baker Street, please. The driver nodded, clucked to his horse, and pulled into the afternoon traffic. London opened up around her as they moved, or rather it transformed neighbourhood by neighbourhood into something different from the Belgravia she knew. They moved from the elegant squares with their carefully tended gardens and their air of prosperous repose into the more bustling districts where commerce actually happened. The streets grew narrower, the crowds grew thicker, the smell shifted from the floral perfume of wealthy households to something earthier, more real. Horse manure and coal smoke and the sweat of working people going about their daily business. Margaret pressed her face slightly toward the window, watching. She had lived in London most of her life, but she had never quite travelled through it like this, not simply passing through, but moving with purpose, with destination. It was a different experience, seeing the city as a progression rather than a backdrop. They passed through neighbourhoods she recognised vaguely. Chelsea, then Kensington, then gradually moving northward. The afternoon was beginning to shift toward evening. The light was taking on that particular amber quality that London light acquired in autumn, turning everything slightly burnished, slightly dreamlike. The street lamps had not yet been lit, but she could see lamplighters beginning their work, climbing their ladders, coaxing the gas to life one lamp at a time. They passed through Soho, where the streets grew even narrower and more chaotic. Here, London showed a different face, not the face of respectable business or elegant leisure, but the face of survival. Shops sold strange things in their windows. Voices in multiple languages competed for space in the air. The smell was extraordinary, a layering of spices and cooking meat and something indefinable that was simply the smell of a neighbourhood where people lived densely, vitally without pretense. Margaret found herself gripping her reticule slightly tighter, not from fear, precisely, but from a kind of awareness that she was moving through territory that was not quite familiar, that she was, in some sense, becoming a stranger to her own city. The cab turned onto Baker Street, and the quality of the air seemed to shift again. This was a neighbourhood of business and professional respectability, not as grand as Belgravia, but respectable nonetheless. The buildings were tall and narrow, brick and stone, with shop fronts on the ground level and offices and residences above. It was the kind of street where important work happened quietly, without fanfare. The cab slowed. Margaret saw the number approaching. 217, 219, 221. The building was as she'd imagined it, and nothing like she'd imagined it at all. It was unremarkable. That was the thing that struck her most forcefully. It was simply a building, tall and narrow with a dark red brick facade and a white-framed door. No plaque announced its significance. No one would know, passing by, that this was where a man lived who solved the unsolvable, who saw what others could not. The cab came to a stop. The driver turned and said, 221B, miss. That'll be... Margaret paid him without haggling, clutched her reticule and stepped out onto the pavement. She stood for a moment, simply looking at the door. It was a perfectly ordinary door. Black paint, gleaming slightly from recent polish. A brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. A small plaque beside the door reading, S. Holmes, Consulting Detective. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the knocker, but before she could strike it, the door opened. Not because of her knock, but as though someone inside had been expecting her, had perhaps watched her arrive, and had decided it was time to admit her. A woman stood in the doorway, not elderly, but not young either. A woman of middle years with grey-streaked hair and an expression that was kind but professional, as though kindness was simply part of her work, no more or less than the management of a household. "Miss Ashworth?" the woman said. She had a Scottish accent, soft but distinct. "Yes," Margaret said. "I have an appointment with Mr. Holmes." "You do indeed. I'm Mrs. Hudson. Come in, please. Mind the step." Margaret stepped over the threshold into warmth and light. The hallway was narrow, lit by a gas lamp that cast everything in a gentle glow. There was a smell of furniture polish and something else. Pipe tobacco, Margaret thought, and something indefinably belonging to this house, this place. The walls were papered in a deep green, and there were paintings, not great paintings, but pleasant ones, landscapes mostly. A small table held a telephone, looking like a strange machine from the future. A coat rack stood nearby, several coats hanging on it, as though people were always coming and going. "Mr. Holmes is expecting you," Mrs. Hudson said, moving toward the stairs. "He's upstairs in the sitting room. Shall I take your coat?" Margaret unwound the shawl from her shoulders and handed it over. Mrs. Hudson folded it with practised efficiency and laid it across her arm. "He doesn't see many people," Mrs. Hudson said conversationally, beginning to climb the stairs. "Especially not on matters like what you've written to him about. But he seemed interested. I could tell because he was rude to me this morning, and he's only ever rude when he's interested." Margaret found herself almost smiling at this. It was oddly reassuring. The idea that rudeness was a sign of engagement, that Holmes's manner meant something. They climbed the stairs, one flight then another. The building seemed taller from the inside than from the outside, the staircase rising through multiple levels, the walls narrowing slightly as they went up. Daylight filtered through a window on the first landing, the last true daylight they would see, Margaret thought. By the time they reached the sitting room, it would be fully evening. Mrs. Hudson knocked on a door at the top of the first flight of stairs. "Come in," a voice called from within. Mrs. Hudson opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing Margaret forward. "Miss Ashworth, sir," she said, and then withdrew, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving Margaret alone. The sitting room was not what she had expected. It was, in fact, rather untidy. There were papers on every available surface, some loose, some bound, some in piles that seemed to follow some logic that Margaret could not immediately discern. A microscope sat on a side table, surrounded by small vials and implements. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with volumes that seemed to have been consulted recently, their spines broken, their pages marked. There were 2 comfortable-looking armchairs arranged near a fireplace, where a fire burned steadily. A violin rested against the mantelpiece, looking somehow both neglected and beloved. And sitting in one of the armchairs, regarding Margaret with eyes that seemed to catalogue her in a single glance, was Sherlock Holmes. He was not what she had expected. This seemed to be a pattern, Margaret reflected. Nothing was quite what she had expected, and so everything was in some way more real than expectation could allow. Holmes was tall, thin to the point of asceticism, with sharp features and hair that seemed to contain a hint of red in the firelight. He wore a dressing gown, despite the hour, or perhaps because of the hour, because he was a man who worked without regard to the normal progression of day. He had intelligent eyes, grey-blue, and they were looking at her now with an expression that was not quite cold, but not quite warm either. It was attentive. It was the look of a man who was paying attention, fully and completely, to her presence. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was cultured, precise, with a quality that suggested he had travelled and lived in places beyond London. "You may sit. That chair is marginally less cluttered than the other, though I make no promises." Margaret sat, perching slightly on the edge of the chair, her reticule held in her lap. "You wrote to me regarding a pattern you had observed," Holmes said. It was not quite a question. "I confess I was intrigued. Most people who write to me are in the grip of either greed or fear, occasionally both. Your letter suggested something else, a genuine attempt to describe something you had seen, without the distortion of emotion." "I wasn't certain it was worth troubling you with," Margaret said. Her voice sounded smaller than she had expected it to sound, but the pamphlets, and the newspapers, and the talk in the markets, it seemed to me that if there was something happening, it was not what they were saying. "An admirable conclusion," Holmes said. He rose from his chair and moved to the fireplace, leaning against the mantelpiece in a posture that was casual, and yet somehow suggested complete readiness. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth, what is your occupation?" "I'm a seamstress and designer," Margaret said. "I work for a household in Belgravia." "And how long have you lived on the Thames Embankment?" 6 months. And in those 6 months you have observed something that the constabulary, the newspapers, and the hysteria-prone citizens of London have somehow missed. Tell me what it is." So Margaret told him. She told him about the parcels, about the identical knots in the string, about the handkerchiefs monogrammed with initials that did not belong to her. She told him about the pauses in the hallway, the sense of a presence beyond her door, the regularity of timing. She told him about her own embarrassment at noticing these things, her fear of being dismissed as a nervous woman prone to fancy. And as she spoke, she watched Holmes's face. She watched him lean slightly forward, watched his eyes narrow slightly in concentration, watched his fingers steeple together as he listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions until she had finished. He simply listened, with the kind of attention that made her feel, for the first time since the pattern had begun, that she was not mad. When she had finished, Holmes was silent for a long moment. "You have observed correctly," he said finally. "These parcels, have you kept them?" "3 of them, yes." "And the hallway, you said the presence came at regular hours?" "Between 7 and 8 o'clock, always when it's darkest, when the fog is thickest." "Excellent," Holmes said. He turned slightly toward the fireplace as though lost in thought. "Your observations are precisely the sort of detail that the constabulary overlooks. They look for dramatic evidence, blood, violence, the obvious marks of crime. But a pattern, Miss Ashworth, is its own form of evidence. A pattern suggests methodology, and methodology suggests—" He paused. He turned back to her and his expression had shifted. It was no longer merely attentive. It was interested. Genuinely, warmly interested. "You have done well to come to me," he said. "This pattern you describe is not random. It is deliberate, calculated, and it is, I suspect, connected to the events that have been troubling your neighbourhood, but not in the way the pamphlets suggest." "Then you'll take the case?" Margaret asked. The hope in her voice surprised her. She had not realised how much she had been hoping for this, how much the burden of knowledge had weighed on her. "I shall indeed," Holmes said, "and you, Miss Ashworth, shall assist me, not as a client, but as an observer. You have already proven yourself remarkably perceptive. Together, I think we shall unravel this matter quite satisfactorily." Margaret felt something release inside her chest. The burden was no longer hers alone. It had been taken up, examined, and deemed worthy of serious attention. "I shall send for Dr. Watson," Holmes said, moving toward the fireplace to ring a bell. "He is nearby. He usually is, and then, Miss Ashworth, we shall begin." Outside, London's evening was settling into full darkness. The fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street, and Margaret, sitting in this untidy, warm, extraordinary room with a man who saw patterns where others saw chaos, felt something that she had not felt in weeks. She felt safe. She felt, finally, that she was no longer alone. Dr. Watson arrived within the hour, brought by Mrs. Hudson with the easy familiarity of someone who had made the journey many times before. He was not what Margaret had expected, though by this point she was beginning to understand that her expectations of London, of Holmes, of the world itself, were consistently undermined by reality. She had imagined Watson as a kind of shadow figure, secondary to Holmes's brilliance. Instead, she found herself looking at a man of medium height, with a kind face marked by lines that suggested both intelligence and suffering, with eyes that held a warmth that Holmes's did not. He was carrying a medical bag. "Holmes mentioned you might have need of medical assessment," Watson said to Margaret, setting the bag down with gentle care. "Though I confess I wasn't entirely certain of the circumstances, Holmes's messages tend toward the cryptic." "I am not in need of medical care," Margaret said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I'm simply, that is, I've observed something unusual in my neighbourhood, and I believed Mr. Holmes might be able to—" "Come now, my dear woman," Watson said, and his tone was so warmly reassuring that Margaret found herself relaxing slightly. "Holmes has asked you here because he finds your observations worthwhile. That is high praise, I can assure you. His standards are exacting. I am Watson. May I call you Miss Ashworth? And may I suggest that we sit down properly and have some tea? Mrs. Hudson has provided some, and I find that nearly any conversation is improved by the presence of tea." It was such a prosaic suggestion that Margaret found herself nearly laughing, not from amusement exactly, but from the sheer relief of being treated as though she were a normal person making a normal visit, rather than a nervous woman requiring medical reassurance. Holmes was already setting out the teapot, a practical brown ceramic thing not at all fancy, and arranging cups with the efficiency of someone who had performed this action countless times. The tea was strong and hot, and when Watson poured it, the amber liquid seemed to catch the firelight and glow. Margaret sat in the armchair that Watson had indicated, accepting a cup and wrapping her fingers around its warmth. The gesture was automatic, but it was also calming. She had checked her door so many times, held herself so carefully at the edges of panic, that the simple act of sitting with tea in her hands felt like a form of medicine in itself. "Now," Watson said, settling into his own chair with a contentment that suggested he had sat in this chair many hundreds of times. "Holmes tells me you've observed a pattern in your neighbourhood that relates to these unfortunate incidents on the embankment. He was impressed by the precision of your observations. That's quite significant, you understand. Holmes is rarely impressed by precision. He expects it. When he's impressed, it means he believes you've seen something genuinely useful." Margaret sipped her tea. It was very hot and slightly bitter in the way that good tea was bitter. It was also, she realised, exactly what she needed. "I don't know if it's useful," she said. "I only know that it's happening. The parcels, the hallway, the timing. It all repeats itself, and I don't know what it means." "That's precisely where observation leaves off and deduction begins," Watson said. He glanced toward Holmes, who was standing near the fireplace, pipe now in hand, the bowl of it glowing faintly as he drew on it. Holmes's particular genius is in that space, in taking the observations of careful people and finding the meaning within them. Holmes did not respond immediately. He stood with his pipe, gazing into the fire as though the flames themselves might contain the answers to Margaret's puzzle. When he spoke, his voice had that quality of attention that she had noticed before, a quality that suggested he was not merely thinking about her problem, but had already begun to think of little else. "Tell me again about the parcels," he said. "Not the contents. We shall examine those shortly, but the delivery. What can you tell me about the deliveries themselves?" Margaret closed her eyes, trying to reconstruct the moments. She had lived through them with such anxiety that they had seemed to blur together, but now, with Holmes asking her to focus on specifics, the details began to clarify. "The first arrived at 6:30 in the evening," she said. "I remember because I had just finished my supper and I was preparing to settle by the fire. The boy who delivered it was unfamiliar. I didn't recognize him. He offered no receipt, no explanation. Simply said it was for my address and handed it over. Did he seem surprised that you were not the intended recipient? Holmes asked. That the parcels were addressed to H.M., not to you? He didn't seem to notice, Margaret said. Or if he did, he made no comment. He was a working boy, the type the post office uses for late deliveries. I had the impression he was simply doing his job quickly and moving on to the next delivery. And the second parcel? Holmes leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. 4 days later, same time, or nearly the same, perhaps a few minutes earlier. A different boy, but the same manner about it. Quick, efficient, no conversation. The parcel was identical in every respect. The same paper, the same twine, the same knot. The knot, Holmes said. He rose from his position by the fireplace and moved toward a drawer in the writing desk. He withdrew a magnifying glass and a small piece of string, which he had apparently kept from the first parcel Margaret had shown him. This knot is significant, Miss Ashworth. Do you understand why? Margaret shook her head. A sailor's knot, Holmes said, holding the string up to the light. Tied with precision. Tied, I would venture to say, by someone who has tied it hundreds of times before. It is not the knot of a casual person doing a casual job. It is the knot of someone with training. Someone accustomed to tying things securely, to travelling with rope, to work that demands reliability in knots. A sailor? Margaret asked. Possibly, or a man who has worked with rope in some other capacity. A dock worker, a rigger, a man involved in the shipping trade. Holmes set down the magnifying glass and returned to his chair. The Thames embankment is full of such men. But the point, Miss Ashworth, is that your parcels are not being sent at random. They are being sent deliberately, with care, by someone who takes pride in the small details of his work. Watson was watching Holmes with an expression that Margaret had come to recognise, a kind of affectionate resignation, as though Watson had seen this performance many times before and never tired of it. But why? Margaret asked. Why send parcels to me at all? Why the hallway pauses? Why the rhythm of it? Always the same hour, always the same pattern. That, Holmes said, is the question we must answer. But before we do, we must gather more information. The parcels themselves, do you have them here? I brought them, Margaret said. She reached for her reticule and withdrew 3 wrapped parcels, each identical to the others, each containing its mysterious set of monogrammed handkerchiefs. I didn't know if they might be useful. Holmes took the parcels with the care of someone handling fragile things, though handkerchiefs were hardly fragile. He examined the wrapping, the twine, the knots with intense attention. He held the parcels to his nose and inhaled slightly. He turned them over and over, running his fingers across the paper as though he might feel something written in its texture. Finally, he set them down and looked at Margaret. These parcels have not been handled by the normal post, he said. Notice the absence of the postmark stamps that would ordinarily mark them as having passed through the post office. These were delivered directly, by hand, by a person operating outside the official postal system. A private messenger? Watson asked, leaning forward with interest. Precisely. A private messenger, or someone making personal deliveries under the guise of a messenger. Holmes turned to Margaret. This person knows your address. This person is deliberately targeting your flat. And this person is taking great care to create a pattern, to establish a rhythm that you would notice, but that would not, to the casual observer, seem particularly threatening. Margaret felt her teacup tremble slightly in her hands, not threatening. But it had felt threatening. The waiting, the regularity, the sense of being watched and marked. How was that not threatening? Watson seemed to sense her distress. He rose from his chair and moved to the fireplace, where he poured more tea into the pot and brought it back to pour a fresh cup for Margaret. What Holmes means, Watson said gently, is that the parcels themselves are not a threat. They are a communication. Someone is trying to tell you something, Miss Ashworth. They are doing it in a manner that you will notice, that you will remember, that you will eventually act upon. And now you have acted upon it. You have come here, to this house, where matters such as these are properly addressed. The warmth of Watson's tone, the reassurance in his words, seemed to settle something in Margaret's chest. She had been so focused on the fear of the pattern that she had not considered the pattern itself as communication, as something meant to be understood, not simply endured. But who? She asked. Who would send parcels to me with false names? Who would stand in my hallway at the same hour each evening? What could they possibly want? That is what we must discover, Holmes said. He had settled back into his armchair, his fingers steepled together beneath his chin. "And I believe, Miss Ashworth, that we must do so by expanding our investigation. You have told me about your observations. Now you must tell me about yourself, your employment, your family, your relations, anyone who might bear you ill will, or anyone who might be connected to the events on the embankment." So Margaret told them. She told them about her work for Mrs. Ashworth, about the household in Belgravia, about the clients who visited for fittings. She told them about her family, her sister in Bath, her elderly mother, her brother who worked in banking. She told them about her life in London, the neighbours she knew, the shops she frequented, the routes she walked. Holmes listened without interrupting, his grey eyes fixed on her face in that way that made it seem as though he was reading her like a book, extracting information not just from her words, but from the way she spoke them, from the pauses and emphasis that revealed her underlying associations and fears. When she had finished, Holmes rose from his chair and moved to a cabinet against the far wall. He withdrew a map of London, not a small map, but a large one, the kind that would normally hang on a wall. He spread it across the floor, weighing down the corners with books. "Show me where you live," he said. Margaret knelt beside the map and pointed to the Thames embankment, to the street where her flat was located. Holmes marked it with a pencil. Then, with Watson's assistance, he began to mark other locations, the places where the victims had been found, the spots mentioned in the newspapers, the areas where the hysteria seemed to be most concentrated. Gradually a pattern emerged, not immediately obvious, but present nonetheless, a kind of clustering, a concentration along certain streets, certain routes. "The victims," Holmes said, moving his finger along the map, "are not random. They follow a path, a route, a pattern of movement that suggests they were not attacked arbitrarily but selected for their location, their habits, their solitude." "Like a hunter studying the movements of prey," Watson said quietly. "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "And your flat, Miss Ashworth, sits directly along this route. The parcels, the hallway presence, these are not threats. They are observations. Someone is studying you as you would study a design before beginning to sew. They're gathering information, establishing patterns, preparing." "Preparing for what?" Margaret asked, and she was proud that her voice remained steady. "That is what we must determine," Holmes said. He stood, looking down at the map as though it might yield further secrets. "But I suspect, Miss Ashworth, that you are important to this puzzle in a way that the other victims are not. Your employment, your isolation, your observation, these things matter. These things mark you as different." Watson had moved to the window and was looking out into the darkness beyond. "It's growing late," he said, "and Miss Ashworth has likely been missed by now. But I think, Holmes, that it would be wise if she did not return to her flat unaccompanied, not because of immediate danger, but because we do not yet know what the pattern requires." Holmes nodded. "I shall provide you with means of communication, Miss Ashworth, and I shall assign a man to watch your building. Discreetly, of course. He will not interfere unless intervention becomes necessary. But you should know that you are being observed. By us, at least, if not by the mysterious sender of parcels." Margaret found herself standing, the map no longer beneath her knees, the warmth of the fire now beginning to feel like the warmth of an actual sanctuary rather than merely a fireplace. The fear that had driven her to Holmes's door had not vanished, but it had transformed. It had become something she shared, something that was now being addressed by minds far sharper than her own. "I should go," she said. "It's late and I haven't informed my employer where I've gone." Watson moved toward the door, already beginning to help her gather her things. "I shall see you out," he said, "and I shall arrange transport for you. A cab, something respectable. You mustn't return through the fog on foot." As Margaret prepared to leave, Holmes pressed a small card into her hand. "My telegraph address," he said, "and my personal address here. If anything occurs, anything at all that seems unusual, you're to contact me immediately. You have demonstrated remarkable judgment, Miss Ashworth. I would not ask you to abandon that judgment now. Trust your instincts." The stairs down seemed shorter than they had on the way up, though Margaret knew that was merely the effect of her changed emotional state. The hallway was warm with gaslight. Mrs. Hudson was waiting with her shawl, and she helped Margaret into it with kind efficiency, as though she had been doing this for years, as though Margaret were not a stranger but simply another person passing through this extraordinary house. "You did well to come," Mrs. Hudson said. Mr. Holmes doesn't often take an interest in matters such as yours. When he does, it means there's something to find. And whatever there is to find, well, he'll find it. That much you can rely on." Outside, Watson had already arranged for a cab. He helped Margaret inside, and as the cab moved away from 221B Baker Street, Margaret turned to look back at the building. It was unremarkable in the darkness, lit only by the gas lamp at its door, and yet it had transformed, in the space of an hour, from a mysterious place to a sanctuary. She pressed the card Holmes had given her into her pocket, and she felt, for the first time since the parcels had begun to arrive, the sense that the unease was not hers alone to carry. It had been taken up by better minds, by men who knew how to look at patterns and extract meaning from them. The fog pressed against the cab's windows as it moved through London's evening streets, but Margaret was no longer frightened of the fog, or of the darkness, or of the unknown presence that had been studying her flat, because now she was no longer alone. The burden had been shared, and in that sharing it had become bearable. The morning after Margaret's visit, Holmes was already at work. Watson found him in the sitting room surrounded by medical journals, newspaper clippings, and a series of photographs that appeared to be of various puncture wounds. The curtains were drawn, and the gas lamp burned despite the daylight outside, suggesting that Holmes had been occupied with his investigation since the early hours. "You've been at this all night," Watson observed, setting down the breakfast tray that Mrs. Hudson had prepared. "Sleep is a luxury I cannot currently afford," Holmes said, not looking up from the journal he was studying. "Consider the timeline, Watson. Victims appearing over the course of 3 weeks, with increasing frequency, each marked with identical punctures, each having consumed a sweet cordial, each having been relieved of their valuables. This is not the work of a common thief. This is systematic, methodical, medical." Watson poured himself tea and settled into his chair, understanding from long experience that Holmes would eventually explain his thoughts, but that explanation would come in Holmes's own time. "The first victim was a dock worker," Holmes continued, finally setting down his journal. "A man named Samuel Carrick, found near the customs house 3 weeks ago. He reported consuming a cordial offered to him by a gentleman who appeared respectable, well-dressed. He remembered a sweet taste, a peculiar aftertaste. Then nothing until he found himself wandering near Waterloo Bridge with no memory of the intervening hours and a gap in his memory corresponding to approximately 2 hours. Drugged, Watson said. Obviously, but with what? That is what we must determine. Holmes rose and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have sent to request interviews with each of the known victims. You shall accompany me, Watson. Your medical knowledge will prove invaluable." The first victim they visited was Samuel Carrick himself, a man of perhaps 40, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his life working outdoors near water. He lived in a modest boarding house near the docks, a building that reeked of damp and cheap cooking. Holmes questioned him with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel, and gradually the account emerged. Details that the newspapers had not reported, details that suggested a pattern beyond what the hysteria had recognized. "The gentleman," Carrick said, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in his small room. "He knew things about the docks. He asked me about my routine, about the hours I worked, about where I went of an evening. It seemed natural enough, gentleman asking a working man about his life. It made me feel, I don't know, noticed, I suppose, important." Watson and Holmes exchanged a glance. This was key information. The perpetrator was not simply selecting victims at random, he was targeting them, studying them, learning their patterns before striking. The second victim, Thomas Hutchins, was a telegraph clerk who had been found wandering near the telegraph office where he worked. His account was remarkably similar. A gentleman who had seemed interested in his work, who had offered cordial as a gesture of friendliness, who had seemed to know more about Thomas's life than was entirely comfortable. "He knew about my evening walks," Hutchins said, his voice still shaky from the trauma. "He knew the exact route I took along the embankment. How could he know that unless he had been watching?" The third, fourth, and fifth victims all told similar stories. A gentleman, respectable in appearance, who had engaged them in conversation, learned their habits, offered cordial as a gesture of friendship or business, and then nothing. Or rather, nothing they could remember, simply the gap of missing time, the small punctures at the neck, the violation of their pockets. By the third interview, Watson had begun to form a hypothesis. "He's searching for something," Watson said as they travelled by cab between locations. "Not money. The amount taken is always trivial. He's searching for something in their blood. Or rather, he's taking their blood, Holmes corrected. The punctures are made by a precision instrument, a spring lancet, if I'm not mistaken, a medical instrument used for bloodletting. The cordial is designed to render the victim insensible without causing lasting damage. The theft of valuables is merely a distraction, a way to make the attack seem random rather than systematic. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson visited 3 pharmacies in the neighbourhood, making discreet inquiries about sales of specific substances. At the third, a small chemist shop squeezed between a tailor and a greengrocer. The proprietor recognised the description of what they were seeking. "Laudanum mixed with wine, you say?" the chemist said, a thin man with spectacles and the careful manner of someone who dealt with dangerous substances daily. A gentleman did indeed purchase such a mixture, though he was vague about its purpose, claimed it was for a private medical practice. I took the precaution of noting the name and address he provided. He withdrew a ledger and pointed to an entry. The name was Dr. Edmund Whitmore. The address was a building on a side street near the embankment, precisely in the area where most of the victims had been found. "The clinic," Holmes murmured, committing the address to memory. "We have found the clinic." That evening, Holmes and Watson conducted their first observation of the building in question. From a distance, it appeared perfectly respectable. A narrow townhouse with a brass plate beside the door reading, "Dr. Edmund Whitmore, Private Medical Practice, Consultations by Appointment." The windows were curtained, but light showed through them. Occasionally a shadow would pass, a figure moving within. There was nothing, obviously sinister, about the building, nothing that would alert a casual observer to anything being wrong, and yet, knowing what they now knew, it seemed to emanate a kind of menace. "We cannot simply break in," Watson said, stating the obvious, but understanding that Holmes might nonetheless be tempted to do precisely that. "We would have no legal basis for doing so." "Not yet," Holmes agreed, "but we can observe. We can learn his patterns, his clientele, his methods. We can gather evidence that will justify intervention by the proper authorities." Over the course of the next week, Holmes and Watson maintained surveillance of the clinic. They observed men arriving, mostly solitary men, working-class men, men who seemed either desperate or curious, or both. They observed these men leaving, often with the dazed appearance of men who had recently been intoxicated and were only beginning to recover. They gathered names when possible, though the doctor was careful about his record-keeping. On the 4th day of surveillance, Holmes managed to catch a glimpse of Dr. Whitmore himself. He was leaving the clinic in the late afternoon, a tall man of perhaps 50, with a peculiar pallor to his skin that suggested he spent little time in sunlight. His teeth, visible briefly as he spoke to someone outside the building, appeared slightly filed, an unusual affectation that Watson found distinctly unsettling. "He's not simply using the blood," Watson said quietly to Holmes as they watched the man disappear down the street. "He's consuming it. Look at him, Holmes. That colour, those teeth. This is not a conventional criminal. This is something else entirely." Holmes's expression had grown contemplative. "A man with an obsession," he said. "A man who has taken a perversion of medical science and transformed it into something far more sinister. The question is not whether he is collecting blood. The evidence suggests he clearly is. The question is why." By the end of the week, they had sufficient evidence to approach the constabulary. Inspector Lestrade, when consulted, was sceptical, until Holmes presented the accumulated accounts of the victims, the purchases of laudanum, the observations of the clinic's suspicious clientele. "You believe this Whitmore has been drugging and bleeding men?" Lestrade said, his tone suggesting he found the accusation barely credible. "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that we have sufficient grounds for investigation. A search of his premises would likely reveal the spring lancets, the cordial, the records of his activities. Whether he is selling the blood or consuming it himself, that remains to be determined, but the pattern is unmistakable." Lestrade arranged for a constable to be posted nearby, ostensibly for public safety given the hysteria on the embankment. In reality, he was there to observe the clinic, to ensure that Dr. Whitmore did not flee before they had gathered sufficient evidence for arrest. That night, Holmes and Watson sat by the fire at 221B, and Watson found himself contemplating the case with a mixture of professional detachment and profound unease. "What drives a man to such lengths?" Watson asked. "To pervert his medical knowledge, to prey upon the vulnerable, to take blood from men who have done nothing to deserve such treatment?" Holmes drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward in the firelight. "Obsession," he said finally. "The human mind is a remarkable instrument, Watson. It is capable of extraordinary heights of reasoning and extraordinary depths of delusion. A man begins with a hypothesis. Perhaps blood holds the key to vitality, to life extension, to transcendence. He studies it, experiments with it, becomes convinced of its truth, and then the line between science and madness blurs. He stops seeing his subjects as people and begins seeing them as merely the means to his obsession." "And the victims?" Watson asked. "Will recover," Holmes said. "The loss of blood they sustained is not life-threatening. The shock and violation, that is another matter. But they will recover, and they will be protected from future harm." A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a young messenger, the same boy who had brought messages before. He carried a letter addressed to Holmes in Margaret's careful handwriting. Holmes opened it and read it, his expression shifting from concentration to something approaching satisfaction. "Miss Ashworth reports that the parcels have ceased," he said. "No delivery for 3 days, and the presence in the hallway has not appeared since yesterday evening. I believe, Watson, that our observations have not gone unnoticed. Dr. Whitmore, knowing that he is being watched, has abandoned his methodical approach. He is preparing either to flee or to make one final move." "We must accelerate our timeline," Watson said, rising from his chair. "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "Tomorrow we shall gather the final evidence, and then we shall bring this matter to its conclusion." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street. But within the sitting room, 2 men sat by the fire, having transformed a pattern of fear and confusion into a coherent picture of crime and obsession. The threads had been gathered. Now they merely needed to be woven into a complete narrative, and Margaret Ashworth, in her small flat on the Thames Embankment, would finally understand why the pattern had been written into her life and what it had meant. The case was entering its final phase. The clinic's records were kept in a leather-bound ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Dr. Whitmore's private study. It was there when Holmes and Watson entered the building under the guise of police investigation, guided by Lestrade and 2 constables, armed with a warrant that had been obtained through careful negotiation and the presentation of evidence. The ledger itself was a remarkable document, a careful record of every patient, every procedure, every collection of blood. But what made it remarkable was not merely the systematic nature of the record, but the notations that accompanied each entry. They were not medical notes, they were observations, reflections, almost philosophical musings on the quality of the blood, the vitality of the subjects, the promise that each collection seemed to offer. Subject M's T, vitality excellent, blood rich with life force, consumed evening of collection, remarkable sense of clarity experienced afterward. Subject HK, weakness detected in constitution, blood thin, insufficient, discard, select more vigorous subject. Subject SC, promising, energy remarkable, effect lasting 3 days, must discover method to extend duration. Holmes read through the ledger with Watson standing beside him, the constables maintaining a discreet distance, Lestrade watching with the expression of a man who had begun to understand that this case was far stranger than he had anticipated. "He's keeping track of the effects," Watson said quietly. "Each time he consumes the blood, he's recording his own physical and mental state. Holmes, this man believes the blood is curing him. He believes it's, what? Extending his life, granting him vitality? Look at the dates," Holmes said, pointing to the earliest entries in the ledger. They went back nearly 2 years. This obsession did not begin with the victims in our neighbourhood. It began long before. He has been conducting this work systematically, methodically, gathering data like a scientist conducting an experiment. The only difference between now and earlier entries is that the entries have become more frequent. The hunger has escalated. In a locked cabinet behind the ledger, they found the tools of his trade, spring lancets, arranged in a neat row, each one gleaming with the careful maintenance of a man devoted to his instruments. Bottles of laudanum, carefully labelled and measured, a leather journal filled with sketches and diagrams, anatomical drawings of the human circulatory system, annotations suggesting an understanding of medicine that was sophisticated enough to be dangerous. and photographs. A series of photographs showing various men in various states of consciousness or recovery, each one marked with a date and a notation. These were not taken with the consent of the subjects, Holmes understood immediately. These were taken by a man documenting his work the way a scientist documents an experiment. "We need to speak with him," Lestrade said, his voice tight. "He should be here. Where is he?" A search of the building revealed that Dr. Edmund Whitmore was not present. A neighbour reported seeing him leave that morning, carrying a bag, moving with the particular urgency of a man who had made a decision and was committed to following through. "He's fleeing," Watson said. "Or he's preparing for something," Holmes said. He stood in the centre of the clinic's examination room, looking at the medical equipment, arranged with such precision. There was a table, padded, with leather straps attached to its corners. There were instruments arranged on a tray, not simply the lancets, but other tools, surgical instruments, implements whose purpose Watson could only guess at. He would not abandon his work unless he believed his work was complete, or unless he believed continuation was impossible. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You must send men to the railway stations, send men to the ports, send men to the roads leading out of London. But you must do it quietly. I don't wish him frightened into violence. He has demonstrated no inclination toward harming his subjects physically, but a man backed into a corner, a man who believes his life's work is about to be destroyed, a man whose obsession has consumed his reason. Such a man might become unpredictable." "I'll see to it," Lestrade said, already moving toward the door. But Holmes raised a hand. "First, I would know more about him. His history, his background, his medical credentials. Send someone to the Royal Medical Society. Send someone to the hospitals. I want to understand how a man with legitimate medical training came to this." It took 2 days of inquiry to piece together the history of Dr. Edmund Whitmore. The story that emerged was not one of simple villainy, but of a man whose descent into obsession had been gradual, incremental, each step seeming rational from the perspective of the previous one. Edmund Whitmore had been a promising physician, trained at Edinburgh, with a particular interest in blood and its properties. 20 years ago he had published several papers on the relationship between blood composition and vitality, theories that had been received with skepticism by the medical establishment. His ideas about blood as the seat of life force, as the key to understanding human vigour and longevity, were considered unscientific, a throwback to earlier, more primitive understandings of medicine. Rejected by his peers, Whitmore had grown increasingly bitter. He had continued his research privately, obsessively, conducting experiments that would never have been permitted by any legitimate medical institution. His clinical practice had dwindled, his reputation had suffered, and gradually his theories had shifted from the scientific to the spiritual, from observation to obsession. 15 years ago, Whitmore had suffered a serious illness, pneumonia, according to the records Watson obtained. He had nearly died. During his recovery, he had become convinced that his survival was due to his own theories about blood, that his vigorous constitution, his strong blood, had allowed him to resist the illness. This conviction had transformed into something deeper. He had begun to believe that blood itself was the answer, that consuming blood, the blood of vigorous living men, might grant him access to their vitality, their strength, their youth. The descent from theory to practice had taken years, but by the time Whitmore had established his private clinic on the Embankment, the line between medical practice and obsessive delusion had been completely erased. "He believes he's a scientist," Watson said, reading through the accounts that Holmes had gathered. "He's documented everything like a researcher, but the research is insane. It's all based on a false premise, and yet he's conducted it with the rigour of a man performing legitimate medical inquiry. That," Holmes said, "is what makes him so dangerous. He is not a common criminal. He is a man of genuine intelligence and genuine medical knowledge who has applied those talents to a fundamentally irrational pursuit. He has convinced himself that he is discovering something essential, something that the conservative medical establishment has refused to acknowledge. In his own mind, he is a pioneer. In reality, he is a predator." On the third day of searching, Whitmore was found, not fleeing London, but still in London, observed near the Embankment itself, near Margaret Ashworth's building. Holmes and Watson arrived at the scene to find Lestrade already present with constables, the area cordoned off with the discretion that Holmes had requested. Whitmore had been found in a small apartment rented under a false name, a room overlooking Margaret's flat filled with observations, sketches of her building, notes about her movements, photographs taken from a distance, showing her arriving and departing, a journal filled with observations about her, speculation about her, a fascination that had become something approaching reverence. "She's different," Whitmore said when they brought him out. He was not struggling, not fleeing. He seemed almost relieved to be caught, as though the burden of his obsession had finally become too heavy to carry alone. The others, they were fuel, subjects. But her, she notices things, she observes. She's like me. She understands patterns. She's not ordinary like the others. Watson felt a chill run down his spine at the words. This man had been studying Margaret, had been observing her, had been recording her movements, all while maintaining his systematic predation on the men of the neighbourhood. And Margaret, with her careful observations, her pattern recognition, had somehow become interesting to him in a way that transcended his usual methodology. "Why her?" Holmes asked, his voice betraying no emotion. "Because she understood," Whitmore said. His pale eyes were fixed on something beyond Holmes, beyond Watson, something only he could see. She recognised the pattern, the parcels, the timing, the rhythm. She understood that there was meaning in it. Most people are blind, but she wasn't blind. She saw. "The parcels," Holmes said. "You were communicating with her." "Testing her," Whitmore corrected. "Seeing if she was truly perceptive, or if she was merely imagining things like the other fools. The pattern had to be precise, had to be exact, so that only someone of genuine intelligence would recognise it. And she did. She recognised it, and she acted. She sought out you." Watson understood then. The parcels had not been random. They had not been harassment. They had been Whitmore's way of selecting his next subject, not from among the vulnerable working men of the embankment, but from someone he perceived as an equal, someone he believed shared his capacity for observation and understanding. The thought was chilling in its implication. Whitmore had been planning something, planning to approach Margaret, to recruit her perhaps, or to study her at a level of intensity that exceeded even his usual obsession. At the police station, in an interview room with Holmes and Watson present, Whitmore spoke with the calm of a man describing his life's work to sympathetic colleagues. "Blood is misunderstood," he said, his thin fingers moving expressively as he spoke. "Medicine has abandoned the study of blood's properties. We bleed patients as a cure for fever, but without understanding what we're actually doing, what we're actually drawing from them. The vitality, the essence, the life force itself resides in the blood. I have been studying this, documenting it. The quality of blood varies from person to person. The young have vigour, the healthy have resilience, if one could extract and concentrate these properties." "You were poisoning people," Watson interrupted, unable to contain himself. "You were drugging them without consent and drawing their blood. You were violating them." Whitmore looked at Watson with an expression of genuine incomprehension. "Harm?" he asked. "I caused them no lasting harm. The amount of blood taken was trivial, less than a physician would remove in normal bloodletting. The cordial rendered them insensible so that they would not experience fear or pain. I was conducting this work with the utmost care, with the utmost precision." "You were conducting this work in secret," Holmes said, "in violation of every principle of medical ethics and law. You were selecting vulnerable men, rendering them unable to consent or resist, and subjecting them to procedures they did not understand and would not have permitted." "But they survived," Whitmore said. "They were unharmed." "They were violated," Holmes said, his voice taking on a hard edge that Watson had rarely heard. "You took their agency, their autonomy, their choice, and you did it in service of an obsession that has no basis in science, no basis in reality." Whitmore fell silent. He looked down at his pale hands, at the fingers that had held the spring lancet, that had taken blood from men who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. And for a moment, Watson thought he saw something flicker in the man's expression. A moment of recognition, perhaps, of what he had done. A moment of understanding that his life's work, the thing he had devoted decades to, was not science, but madness. But the moment passed. Whitmore looked up, again, and his expression had returned to its previous state. The expression of a man who had committed himself to a belief so completely that reality could no longer touch him. "They were fortunate," Whitmore said quietly, "to participate in my work, to contribute to the advancement of knowledge about blood and vitality. They should have been honoured." Watson rose from his chair and stepped out of the room. He could not bear to listen further, could not bear to hear this man speak about violation as though it were discovery, about predation as though it were research. Holmes remained, continuing his questions, gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, but Watson stood in the hallway feeling the weight of human nature's capacity for self-deception, for the transformation of evil into something that seemed to the perpetrator like virtue. Later, as they walked through London's evening streets toward 221B, Watson spoke to Holmes about the experience. "He genuinely believes in what he was doing," Watson said. "That's what's most disturbing. He's not a man pretending to be a scientist to justify criminal behaviour. He's a man who has so thoroughly convinced himself of his own theories that reality no longer registers as contradicting them." "Yes," Holmes said quietly. They walked in silence for a moment before he continued. "That is the nature of obsession, Watson. It begins as passion, as genuine belief in something. But when that belief is not tempered by reality, when it is not subjected to the scrutiny of peers and evidence, it becomes delusion. And a delicate mind applied to delusion becomes far more dangerous than a simple criminal mind could ever be. The case was essentially concluded. Whitmore had been arrested. The clinic would be closed. The victims would be identified and informed. But as Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, there remained one final matter to attend to. Margaret Ashworth would have to be told the truth about why she had been chosen, about the intensity of the observation she had been subjected to, about the fact that her very perceptiveness, the quality that had made her seek out Holmes in the first place, had marked her as interesting to a predatory mind. And they would have to do so in a way that did not destroy her, in a way that transformed her fear into understanding, that completed the journey from isolation to clarity. That would be the final thread to be woven. Margaret was summoned to 221B Baker Street on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 days after Dr. Edmund Whitmore's arrest. Holmes's message had been brief, but it carried a tone of finality, the sense that the investigation had reached its conclusion, and that she, as the person who had initiated it, deserved to hear the full accounting of what had been discovered. She climbed the stairs to the sitting room with a different feeling than before. The anxiety that had driven her here the first time had transformed into something else, not quite peace, but the patient anticipation of understanding. Whatever awaited her in that room, it would be the truth, and the truth, however complex, was preferable to the endless speculation and fear. Watson was there when she entered, standing by the fireplace with that particular warmth that had become familiar and comforting. Holmes was seated in his armchair, a cup of tea growing cold beside him, his mind clearly already engaged with what he was about to explain. "Miss Ashworth," Holmes said, rising to greet her. "I trust you received my message. Please sit. There is much to tell you, and I believe you deserve to hear all of it." So Holmes told her. He told her about the clinic, about the victims, about the systematic nature of Whitmore's work. He told her about the ledger, the instruments, the photographs. He told her about the history of a man whose brilliant mind had been twisted by rejection and obsession into something profoundly damaged. And then he told her about herself. "The parcels," Holmes explained, "were not harassment. They were selection. Whitmore had been observing your neighbourhood for months, selecting his subjects from among the solitary men who walk the embankment at night. But then he noticed you, your patterns of movement, your careful observation of your surroundings, your evident intelligence. He became fascinated." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "He was watching me." "Yes," Holmes said simply. "The parcels were his way of testing you. He wanted to see if you possessed the capacity for genuine observation, the ability to recognize patterns that others missed. The identical knots, the regular timing, these were not random. They were carefully designed to be noticed by someone of superior perceptiveness." "What would he have done?" Margaret asked, and her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "If I had not come to you?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He exchanged a glance with Watson, and in that glance Margaret understood what neither of them needed to say aloud. Whitmore had been planning something, whether recruitment or observation or something darker still. His fascination with her represented a kind of danger that transcended his usual methodology. "You did precisely what you should have done," Watson said gently. "You noticed something wrong, and you sought help. Your actions not only protected yourself, but they allowed us to stop him before he could escalate his activities." "The other victims," Margaret said, "will they recover?" "Physically, yes," Holmes said. The amount of blood taken was not life-threatening. Psychologically, that is another matter. Violation leaves its mark, Miss Ashworth, but they will have the knowledge that the person who harmed them has been stopped, that his methods have been exposed, that they are safe. That knowledge is its own form of healing. Margaret sat with this information, feeling it settle into her understanding like stones sinking into still water. The unease that had driven her to Holmes's door had a source now. It had a name, a face, a rational explanation, and somehow that made it bearable. "The parcels will no longer arrive," Holmes said. "The presence in your hallway has ceased. Your neighbourhood is safe, Miss Ashworth. The pattern that troubled you has been broken." "But I should have been afraid," Margaret said quietly. "I should have recognised the danger." "You recognised enough," Holmes said. "You recognised that something was wrong, and you acted on that recognition. That is all that can be asked of any person." That evening Margaret walked home through London's familiar streets. The fog had lifted slightly, and the city seemed smaller than it had before, more comprehensible, less threatening. She passed the clinic's building, now marked with a police notice, its windows dark. She did not look at it directly, but she acknowledged its presence, acknowledged that something profoundly wrong had occurred there, and that it had now been addressed. When she reached her flat, she unlocked the door, checking it once, but only once, as a normal person would. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The armchair by the fire, the book from Moody's library still open where she had abandoned it, the teacup from that first evening of unease sitting on its saucer. She gathered up the cup and carried it to the kitchen. She emptied the cold tea down the drain and washed the cup with careful attention, as though the simple act of cleaning were a kind of ritual, a formal acknowledgement of transition from one state to another. Then she returned to her chair by the fire, and she poured herself fresh tea. The kettle's whistle was the same sound it had always been. The firelight was the same warm amber it had always been. But Margaret herself had changed. She had been tested, and she had proved capable. She had noticed something that others missed, and she had had the courage to act on it. Outside, rain began its gentle stitching against the window pane. The foghorns called to one another from the river. The city breathed its vast, indifferent breath around her small, warm room. But Margaret was no longer listening for threats. She was simply listening, the way one listens to a familiar song, aware of the beauty in the familiar patterns. She thought of Holmes sitting by his fire in his cluttered room, already moving on to the next puzzle, the next pattern waiting to be solved. She thought of Watson, with his gentle wisdom and his capacity to see people as they truly were. She thought of Mrs. Hudson, with her quiet efficiency and her understanding that extraordinary things happened in that ordinary house on an ordinary street. And she thought of Dr. Edmund Whitmore, locked away now, his obsession finally brought to an end, his belief in his own righteousness finally shattered by the reality of his actions. She did not feel pity for him. The violation he had committed was too profound for that. But she felt a kind of sadness at the waste of it, at a mind so capable being twisted into something so destructive. The night deepened around her. The city's sounds gradually diminished as evening transitioned toward the deep hours of night. Margaret's eyes grew heavy, not from fear or anxiety, but from the simple tiredness that comes from having carried a burden and then set it down. She rose from her chair and prepared for bed. She checked her windows, not obsessively, but with reasonable care. She locked her door, once firmly with the confidence of someone who knew that the lock would hold, that the building was safe, that she was protected not by vigilance alone, but by knowledge. And as she lay in bed, listening to the rain and the distant bells of the city, Margaret felt something she had not felt in weeks. She felt peace. The pattern had been solved. The unease had been explained. The mystery that had driven her to seek out a detective on a fog-wrapped street in London had been unravelled, and in its unravelling she had discovered something about herself. She was capable. She was observant. She was worthy of being taken seriously. Sleep came gently, like a friend who had been waiting patiently for her to be ready to receive it, and as her eyes closed, and as the sounds of London faded into the soft susurration of rain, Margaret understood that she had passed through something, and that she had emerged intact. Outside in the fog and the gaslight, Holmes and Watson moved through the city's evening streets, already engaged with the next case, the next pattern waiting to be unravelled. Behind them, on the Thames embankment, in a small flat overlooking the river, a woman slept peacefully, knowing that even in London's vast complexity, there were those who watched, who listened, and who acted with both justice and compassion. And the night, gentle and eternal, carried them all toward morning,